In March 1999, a woman ran naked through the streets of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, screaming that she had been held captive in a trailer where a man had told her calmly and methodically exactly how he was going to destroy her mind before he destroyed her body. When police entered that trailer, they found something that made seasoned investigators physically ill. Not a crime scene, but a laboratory designed to erase human will. Before we continue, I want you to comment below. What psychological defense mechanism do you think would activate first if someone told you that resistance was completely pointless? David Parker Ray did not kill in fits of rage. He did not act on impulse. He did not lose control. For nearly 40 years, he refined a system of psychological conditioning so precise, so methodical, that many of his victims walked free afterward, yet could not explain what had happened to them. Some doubted their own memories. Some believed they had imagined it. Some never reported it at all. This was not an accident. This was the design. Ray understood something that most violent offenders do not. That the most complete form of control is not physical restraint, but the elimination of the belief that escape is even possible. David Parker Ray was born in Belen, New Mexico, in November 1939. His early life offered few obvious warning signs to outsiders. He grew up in a rural environment, served in the United States Army, and later worked as a mechanic at Elephant Butte State Park. Eventually, he became a civilian employee at a naval weapons testing facility, a position that required technical precision, adherence to procedure, and the ability to work with complex mechanical systems. These skills would later define his crimes in ways that investigators found deeply disturbing. Ray was not chaotic, he was organized. He did not improvise. He planned, he documented, he rehearsed. He treated human suffering as an engineering problem to be solved through iteration and refinement. Psychologically, Ray exhibited extreme sexual sadism, but it was not the sadism of explosive violence. It was cold, procedural, and systematic. He derived gratification not from chaos but from control. Not from spontaneous cruelty but from the orchestration of terror over time. He was married multiple times. He had children. He held steady employment. To neighbors and coworkers, he appeared unremarkable. This is a pattern seen in many organized offenders, the ability to compartmentalize, to present a functional exterior while maintaining a hidden interior life of escalating deviance. But Ray was not simply hiding his crimes. He was perfecting them. Ray owned property in Truth or Consequences, a small town in southern New Mexico named after a 1950s radio game show. On that property sat a white cargo trailer, approximately 15 feet long. From the outside, it looked like a storage unit or a workshop. Inside, it was something else entirely. Ray called it the toy box. This was not investigator terminology. This was his own language. The trailer was soundproofed. The windows were blacked out. The interior was lined with acoustic insulation to prevent sound from escaping. The door was reinforced. Once someone was inside, the outside world could not hear them. The space contained a gynecological examination table modified with restraints, chains and cables anchored to the walls and ceiling, pulleys and winches for suspension electric shock devices, surgical instruments, speculums and dilators, syringes, and medical drugs. Mirrors positioned at specific angles, a video camera on a tripod, shelves lined with tools, lubricants, and implements. Everything was organized. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. This was not a dungeon. It was a laboratory. Ray had spent years constructing this space, refining its layout, testing its acoustics, ensuring that every element served his goal, the complete psychological and physical domination of another human being. But the most disturbing element was not the equipment. It was the audio tape. David Parker Ray understood that physical restraint alone does not guarantee compliance. A person in chains can still resist mentally. They can still hope. They can still plan. They can still believe that rescue is possible. Ray sought to eliminate that belief before physical abuse even began. After abducting a victim, typically a woman hitchhiking or vulnerable due to intoxication or isolation, Ray would transport her to the toy box. She would be restrained immediately upon entry, stripped of clothing and positioned on the examination table. Disoriented, terrified, and unable to move, she would then hear a voice. It was Ray's voice. Calm, conversational, almost instructional. It was a pre-recorded audio tape, and it played automatically. The tape was approximately 30 minutes long. Ray had scripted it carefully. He had rehearsed it. He had recorded it multiple times until the tone was exactly right. Not angry, Not excited but matter-of-fact, clinical, inevitable. The tape explained, "You are now my property. You have been taken for my use. Resistance is pointless, escape is impossible. If you try to escape, you will be hunted and killed. If you scream, no one will hear you. If you fight, you will be punished. Pain is inevitable, but obedience will reduce it. You will be kept here for an extended period. You will be used sexually in ways you cannot imagine. You will be trained. You will learn to obey." The tape then described in explicit and graphic detail the acts of sexual violence that would occur. It framed these acts not as threats, but as foregone conclusions. Not as possibilities, but as scheduled events. This was deliberate psychological warfare. By narrating the abuse before it occurred, Ray induced anticipatory terror. The victim's mind would begin to imagine the acts described, creating a feedback loop of fear that amplified the psychological impact of the actual abuse when it occurred. By framing the abuse as inevitable, Ray induced learned helplessness. Research in psychology has shown that when subjects believe they have no control over aversive stimuli, they stop attempting to escape even when escape becomes possible. Ray was weaponizing this principle. By speaking calmly and instructionally, Ray positioned himself not as an out-of-control monster, but as an authority figure explaining rules. This created a perverse dynamic in which compliance felt like the rational response. The tape also contained strategic lies designed to isolate the victim psychologically. Your family will never find you. The police will not look for you. No one knows where you are. You are not the first. Others have been here before you. Some of them are still here. This last statement was particularly cruel. It suggested that other victims were present, either dead or still captive, reinforcing the idea that escape was impossible and that Ray's control was absolute. Would you have believed the tape? Or would you have clung to the hope that it was a bluff? The systematic erasure of identity. Ray did not simply want to hurt his victims. He wanted to erase them. Throughout captivity, victims were referred to by numbers or degrading terms, never by name, told repeatedly that their previous identity no longer existed, forced to respond to commands using specific phrases that reinforced submission, denied any personal autonomy, including control over basic bodily functions, kept in states of sensory deprivation or overload to prevent psychological grounding. This process is known in psychological literature as depersonalization. By stripping away name, autonomy, and agency, Ray sought to replace the victim's sense of self with a new identity, that of an object existing solely for his use. Mirrors were positioned throughout the toy box not for Ray's viewing pleasure, but to force victims to witness their own degradation. This created a dissociative split, the self observing the self being abused, which often leads to psychological fragmentation. Ray also used drugs extensively. He administered sedatives, muscle relaxants, and dissociative anesthetics. These substances caused memory fragmentation, temporal disorientation, difficulty distinguishing reality from hallucination gaps in conscious awareness. This pharmacological assault served two purposes. First, it made resistance physically impossible. Second, it made coherent memory formation nearly impossible. When victims were eventually released, many could not provide clear timelines. They could not describe events in sequence. They doubted their own perceptions. Some believed they had experienced a nightmare or a drug-induced hallucination rather than a real event. This was exactly what Ray intended. Ray did not act alone, and this fact is psychologically significant. His longtime girlfriend Cindy Hendy actively participated in the abductions and abuse. She helped lure victims, assisted in restraining them, and participated in the sexual violence. Her presence served multiple functions. It made victims easier to approach. As a couple appears less threatening than a lone man, it reinforced the narrative that escape was impossible. As multiple captors suggested organization and resources, it validated Ray's authority. As Hendy's compliance modeled the submission Ray demanded, it increased the psychological isolation of victims, who could not appeal to Hendy for help. Another accomplice, Dennis Roy Yancey, was later convicted of murdering a woman named Marie Parker, whose death was connected to Ray's activities. Yancey testified that Ray had instructed him in methods of disposal and had discussed previous killings. The presence of accomplices is common in organized sexual sadism cases. It creates a subculture of shared deviance in which extreme acts are normalized through group participation. For Ray, it also meant that his system could continue to function even when he was not personally present. Do you think Cindy Hendy was a victim herself, conditioned into compliance? Or was she a willing participant who found gratification in the suffering of others? In March 1999, Ray and Hendy abducted Cynthia Vigil, a 22-year-old woman, from a parking lot in Albuquerque. Vigil was a sex worker, a demographic Ray specifically targeted because he believed such women were less likely to be reported missing and less likely to be believed if they did report abuse. Vigil was transported to the toy box. She was restrained. She heard the tape. She endured days of sexual torture and psychological conditioning. But Vigil did something that Ray had not anticipated. She waited. She complied outwardly while remaining mentally resistant. She observed. She noted patterns. She identified moments of vulnerability. On March 22, 1999, Hendy briefly left Vigil alone while Ray was out of the trailer. Vigil had been left in restraints, but Hendy had made a critical error. She had left a key within reach. Vigil freed herself. She grabbed an ice pick from a nearby table. When Hendy returned, Vigil stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and fled the trailer, naked and bleeding, still wearing a metal collar around her neck. She ran to a nearby mobile home and pounded on the door. The residents called police. When officers arrived, Vigil was hysterical but coherent enough to direct them back to the property. She told them about the trailer. She told them about the tape. She told them about the things Ray had done. Police obtained a search warrant and entered the toy box. What they found confirmed everything Vigil had said and worse. The search of Ray's property yielded evidence that stunned even experienced investigators. Inside the toy box, police found the restraint table, the audio tape, hundreds of photographs of women in various states of distress, videotapes of sexual assaults, written logs detailing dates, acts and victim responses, diagrams and schematics for restraint devices, a collection of homemade and modified torture implements, drugs and syringes. The photographs were particularly disturbing. They depicted dozens of women, many of whom appeared unconscious or heavily drugged. Some were positioned in ways that suggested they were unaware they were being photographed. Investigators began the painstaking process of identifying these women. Many were never identified. Some were located and interviewed, but had no memory of being in the trailer. Some remembered fragments but had never reported the crimes, either because they doubted their own memories or because they feared they would not be believed. This confirmed Ray's strategy. By using drugs and psychological conditioning, he had created a situation in which many of his victims could not serve as witnesses against him. The audio tape was transcribed and analyzed. Forensic psychologists noted its sophisticated use of conditioning techniques, including repetition of key phrases to reinforce helplessness, framing of abuse as inevitable to reduce resistance, use of calm tone to establish authority, strategic lies to increase isolation, explicit description of future acts to induce anticipatory terror. This was not the work of an impulsive offender. This was the work of someone who had studied the psychology of control and had refined his methods over years, possibly decades. Ray was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and torture. He was never charged with murder, and this fact has generated significant controversy and speculation. During interrogations, Ray made statements suggesting he had killed victims and disposed of their bodies. He mentioned dumping bodies in Elephant Butte Lake, using acid to dissolve remains, burying bodies in remote desert locations. However, no bodies were ever recovered. No physical evidence of homicide was found. No missing persons cases could be definitively linked to Ray through forensic evidence. This does not mean Ray did not kill. It means that proof of murder could not be established to the legal standard required for prosecution. Several factors complicate the question. Ray specifically targeted transient women, sex workers, and hitchhikers. Demographics less likely to be reported missing Elephant Butte Lake is vast and deep, making body recovery extremely difficult. The desert surrounding Truth or Consequences is remote, and largely unsurveyed. Ray had access to chemicals and tools through his employment that could facilitate body disposal. Ray had decades to refine his disposal methods. Investigators believe Ray may have killed as many as 60 women, but this number is speculative. It is based on the number of unidentified women in photographs, statements made by Ray and his accomplices, the duration of his criminal activity, the sophistication of his methods, but belief is not evidence. Legally, Ray was never convicted of murder. For the families of missing women in New Mexico during this period, this lack of closure is a continuing source of anguish. Ray's trial began in 2001. The prosecution faced significant challenges. Many potential victims could not remember the abuse clearly due to drugging. Some victims were too traumatized to testify. The defense argued that the toy box was used for consensual BDSM activities. The audio tape, while disturbing, did not prove that actual crimes had occurred. The photographs and videos were difficult to date and contextualize. The trial was moved due to pretrial publicity. Jury selection was difficult. The evidence was so disturbing that jurors and court staff required psychological support. In April 2001, Ray was convicted of kidnapping and sexual torture in connection with 3 victims: Cynthia Vigil, Angelica Montano, and Kelly Garrett. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison. Cindy Hendy pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 36 years in exchange for her testimony. Dennis Roy Yancey pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Marie Parker and received 2 consecutive 15-year sentences. Ray's daughter, Glenda Jiang Ray, was also implicated in some of the crimes and received a sentence of 9 years. But before Ray could be transferred to a long-term facility, something happened that denied his victims the closure of knowing he would die in prison. On May 28, 2002, David Parker Ray suffered a heart attack in his cell at the Lee County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico. He was pronounced dead shortly after. He was 62 years old. He had served less than 1 year of his sentence. For survivors, this was devastating. There would be no further trials, no additional confessions, no opportunity to confront him in court, no chance for him to provide information about other victims or burial sites. Ray took his secrets with him. The case of David Parker Ray is studied in forensic psychology and criminal profiling courses because it represents an extreme example of organized sexual sadism, combined with sophisticated psychological manipulation. Ray's methods demonstrate the use of conditioning techniques to induce learned helplessness, the strategic use of drugs to impair memory formation, the weaponization of anticipatory fear through narration of future abuse, the systematic erasure of identity through depersonalization, the exploitation of victim demographics less likely to be believed or reported missing. Survivors of Ray's crimes have exhibited severe and lasting psychological damage, including complex post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative identity disorder, chronic depersonalization and derealization, severe trust impairment, difficulty forming stable relationships, persistent nightmares and flashbacks, suicidal ideation. Some survivors have required lifelong psychiatric care. Some have been unable to maintain employment or stable housing. Some have struggled with substance abuse as a means of managing intrusive memories. This outcome was not incidental. It was engineered. Ray designed his system not only to avoid detection, but to ensure that even if victims escaped or were released, they would be unable to provide coherent testimony or would doubt their own experiences to the point of not reporting the crimes at all. In this, he was partially successful. Investigators believe that many victims never came forward, either because they could not remember clearly enough to report, or because they feared they would not be believed. The case of David Parker Ray remains open in many respects. Questions that will likely never be answered include: how many victims were there in total? How many were killed? Where are the bodies? When did the crimes actually begin? Were there other accomplices who were never identified? Were any of the unidentified women in the photographs ever located? Did Ray's employment at the Naval Weapons Facility provide him with resources or knowledge that facilitated his crimes? The FBI and New Mexico State Police have continued to investigate cold cases that may be connected to Ray. But without his cooperation, and without physical evidence, many of these cases will remain unsolved. For the families of missing women in New Mexico during the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, the question of whether their loved one encountered David Parker Ray is a source of ongoing anguish. The broader implications. The Ray case forced law enforcement and mental health professionals to confront uncomfortable realities about the nature of organized sexual violence. That offenders can operate for decades without detection if they are methodical. That victim selection based on marginalized demographics reduces the likelihood of investigation. That psychological conditioning can be as effective as physical restraint. That memory impairment through drugs can prevent prosecution even when victims survive. That the absence of bodies does not mean the absence of murder. It also highlighted systemic failures in the protection of vulnerable populations. Many of Ray's suspected victims were sex workers, hitchhikers, or women struggling with addiction. These are populations that historically receive less attention from law enforcement when they go missing. Ray understood this. He exploited it. David Parker Ray spent decades perfecting a system designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while minimizing the risk of detection or prosecution. He succeeded in many respects. He evaded justice for most of his life. He died before serving meaningful time. He never provided a full accounting of his crimes. But he failed in one critical respect. Cynthia Vigil escaped. She survived. She testified. She ensured that Ray's system was exposed and dismantled. The question that remains is not whether Ray was a monster. The question is how many others like him are operating right now, in small towns and rural areas, targeting vulnerable populations, refining their methods, and relying on the same assumptions Ray relied on, that certain victims will not be missed, will not be believed, and will not be able to articulate what was done to them. If someone told you that screaming was pointless because no one would hear you, would you scream anyway? Or would you save your energy for the moment when escape became possible? That is the question Cynthia Vigil answered. And her answer is the only reason we know David Parker Ray's name at all.